Hi friends, my name is Abby Lee Hood. I'm a queer journalist, I use they them pronouns, and I'm also a board member of Bluegrass Pride. Today I'm really excited to bring you a brief and not at all exhaustive history of bluegrass music. I'm also going to be reading from a script behind the screen, so there's just no way I could memorize all this. Bluegrass is a sort of amalgamation of other genres that came before it, but I'd like to quote from my own story in Vice titled How History Books Erased the Marginalized Voices That Built Bluegrass. I'll give you some of the beginnings of bluegrass that we all know and recognize, and then we'll take it back a little further to talk about which artists influenced the genre, and lastly, we'll talk about the current state of affairs and what we can do to make it more inclusive. So in that Vice article I wrote, on December 8th, 1945, Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys stepped onto the Grand Ole Opry stage alongside Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs for the very first time. Each man would become a historic icon on their instruments, the mandolin, guitar, and banjo, respectively. Many consider that Opry show just months after the end of World War II, the day the genre of bluegrass was born. Now, 75 years later, fans and bluegrass organizations are gearing up to celebrate its diamond anniversary. So keep in mind, this article was published last year in 2020 when bluegrass was celebrating its 75th anniversary. The story continues. Monroe was a pioneer in many ways, pulling musical influences and instruments together in new ways. But there are problems with centering him as the sole father of bluegrass. While he was a microcosm of the American melting pot, perhaps even a symptom of it, in truth, bluegrass's history is much longer, strewn with an array of black, queer, and marginalized artists time left behind and failed to credit. Because of that Opry show and Monroe's impact on bluegrass, most of the time when we talk about Bill Monroe, we hear that nickname, the father of bluegrass. And there's no doubt that he brought the style together in new and innovative ways, but the genre has roots that go back centuries further and is often far more diverse than we think. So on the more historical elements of bluegrass, bluegrassheritage.org says the following. The history of bluegrass music begins with the people who migrated to America in the 1600s from Ireland, Scotland, and England, and brought with them basic styles of music that are generally considered to be the roots of modern bluegrass. As the Jamestown settlers began to move out into North and South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia, they wrote songs about day-to-day life in the new land. Since most of these people lived in remote areas, the songs reflected life on the farm or in the hills. This music was referred to as country music or mountain music. So those were the terms that we used before the phrase bluegrass or term bluegrass came to be in the mid-1900s. But even centuries ago, it was never just only white people who made the genre what it is today. I want to go back to some research I included in my Vice article because when I asked about the origins of modern bluegrass, like Monroe played, I spoke with Rhiannon Giddens, a combination historian and musician who has given keynotes and addresses about bluegrass history for both the International Bluegrass Music Association and the Americana Music Association. She told me the first bluegrass pickers were open about the black musicians who influenced them, and in that Vice article, I included this quote from Giddens. Bluegrass came out of a thriving string band tradition that already existed and was co-created by black culture, Giddens said. The first generation of bluegrass musicians were open about the black people they learned from. And then in that story, I went on to write, as bluegrass got its legs in the recording industry, things began to change. Giddens, who is a Grammy-winning founding member of the Carolina Chocolate Drop, said industry executives left black artists out of bluegrass recordings and relegating them to race music days. Record labels would go into communities and recruit artists to play hillbilly music and other genres to sell records, and black artists would be recruited to play jazz or blues. This shaped the narrative around black musicians, and as the recording industry grew, it only got worse. Giddens said many wealthy white business owners directly benefited from storytelling about a predominantly white culture. So over time, black musicianship was intentionally wiped from the history of bluegrass. It was carefully crafted in the interest of white supremacy, Giddens said. Fiddling contests started as a way to celebrate the native music of America, but black people were not allowed to enter. So clearly, much of bluegrass has been extremely whitewashed. And not only did black and other musicians of color create a lot of the repertoire, but the white musicians who did create some of the most popular songs we play today often included themes of slavery in the songs that they wrote. So I'd like to turn now to a story I did about Tristan Scroggins' excellent new songbook. It includes the history of the 10 tunes he gives sheet music for, and it was published a few weeks ago. The article was in the Nashville Scene, and here's what I wrote. After 23 years of playing bluegrass, I figured there were few things left about the music that could truly surprise me. But finding out Angeline the Baker, one of my favorite fiddle tunes, was originally written about a slave separated from her lover at a slave auction, I can't say it's exactly unexpected, given that bluegrass was largely built on black culture, but it sure made me think twice about playing it. That is right, Angeline the Baker has a really dark history. Here's more from that article. The original was written by Stephen Foster, a minstrel and Civil War era songwriter who often included racist stereotypes. Several statues of Foster have been taken down recently. Other tunes written as minstrel songs may be just as concerning, but aren't uncommon in the bluegrass lexicon. Scroggins points out that Turkey in the Straw is a tune like that with a surprisingly modern use. And for those of you who don't know, Turkey in the Straw is the ice cream truck song. And here's how Scroggins handles knowing that really terrible history. Scroggins says he stopped playing other tunes altogether because of their history. And when we chatted for this Nashville scene piece, he did say that there were some songs that were just kind of irredeemable and that you couldn't play. Going back into the quote now, though he notes that this song is now in public domain. It's also one of the most popular fiddle tunes of all time, Angeline the Baker. Still, it's important to take cues about playing these tunes from marginalized communities, and at the least, Scroggins says we should acknowledge its origin. Of course, history has often neglected to mention other influences too, so I'd like to turn back to that original Vice article and include some quotes from our very own Justin Hiltner, banjo player extraordinaire and chair of our board at Bluegrass Pride. In that article, this is what I wrote. They highlighted the exclusion of the mothers of bluegrass, female artists who led the genre or were ahead of their time, holding desegregated concerts in the 60s. Hiltner said that while exclusion of women and LGBTQ musicians has been widespread, excluded artists have always found a way to continue sharing their craft. Other marginalized people wouldn't have a place if women hadn't carved a path, Hiltner said. You can try and exclude LGBTQ people, but women are all open-armed to folks like me. They know what it feels to be on the outside. So, if bluegrass has sometimes neglected to mention the women, queer people, black people, and other musicians of color who built it, what can we do? The answer is a little complicated, like Scroggins said, but we should probably take our cues about which songs to play and which artists to celebrate from marginalized creators. And of course, I wouldn't even be talking about this right now if it weren't for Bluegrass Pride. We're dedicated to creating a more inclusive genre and are particularly passionate about celebrating black and queer musicians who have often been left out of the music's history. Bluegrass, much like our entire country today, is a mix of cultures, ethnicities, and many of the influences date back centuries and then were solidified in that historic Grand Ole Opry show. I hope y'all will continue to enjoy this music and celebrate how inclusive it always has been right from the very beginning. All the links to those articles, including my own and the others, will be in the description. I'm also going to put together a PDF about some of the names, dates, and places. So if you're a music teacher and you would like to do a little pop quiz for your students or your kids about the history of bluegrass, we'll have that ready for you as well. I'd also like to let you know that Bluegrass Pride is looking for members, volunteers, sponsors, and more. Bluegrass Pride wants you to get involved. I'm getting tongue-tied even though I have a script. At whatever level, you're able to participate in creating spaces for LGBTQ plus folks in roots music. Our members, who give monthly or annually, help make sustainable growth possible for Bluegrass Pride. And individual donations have always powered what we do. We appreciate each and every gift, but if financial contributions aren't doable for you because times are tough, we understand. Please consider giving your time and becoming a volunteer. Go to bluegrasspride.net to learn about becoming a member or volunteering with us. Thanks for watching.